Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I want to be going over the basics of classes and objects in Python. Now, you might have already heard about people talking about Python as an object-oriented programming language. And the reason why we refer to Python as being object-oriented is because almost everything in Python is an object of a corresponding class. If we, for example, print the data type of a string, let's say we print the data type of the string hello, and I'll go ahead and run this, you'll see in the console output that it says class string. And the reason why it says class string in the console output is because the word hello, as it is written over here in our editor, is an object of the class string. And similarly, if you go ahead and do this for another data type, for example, let's take an integer, let's say for example 16, and I'll go ahead and run this. The console output now says class integer, and that is because the number 16 is an object of the class integer. Now, to better understand what classes and objects are and how they work together, we're going to look at a really easy example. In order to set the scene for this example, I'll say the following. Imagine that there's a big university which has plenty of students, and we want to represent all these students within an application. After all, it would be really helpful if we had an overview of what students we have and what data is attributed to them. So let's say that our students are represented by a first name, a last name, and an email address. And we want to somehow create a blueprint for all these students. Let me show you what I mean. So we're going to create a class and call it student. And for now, we want to leave this class empty. If we want to leave a class empty in Python, make sure to write the keyword pass, otherwise you'll get an error. So we'll leave it empty for now, and now we'll create two instances of the class student, which are going to be our first two students. So it's going to be student underscore 1. That's going to be an object of our class student, and we're going to have two students just to make it a bit more interesting. So we'll have two students, and there are both objects of the class student. And these two students have data which is attributed to them. So let's give them the data. For example, let's say that our student 1 has a first name. We'll abbreviate first with first name with first. First equal to Bob. And our student also has a second name, a surname, and we'll abbreviate the surname with last, which is short for last name, and we'll call him Bob Griffin. And we also have an email address for this student, student underscore 1 dot email, and we'll give him a standardized email address, and it's quite usual and quite common for universities to give an email address along the lines of bob.griffin@mail.com. So first name and second name separated by a dot, and then some sort of standardized ending. So that's our first student finished, and we can also go on to define a second student, and this second student is going to be Sarah Parker, and the last name is going to be Parker, And she will as well have a standardized email address in the same format as Bob Griffin does above. All right, so now we've created two students and given them some data. We can go ahead and print out some values. For example, if we were to print out the first name of our first student, we could simply write student1.first and run it, and you'll see that Bob pops up, which is the first name of our first student. Similarly, we can go ahead and do something similar for our second student. We can now, for example, print out the last name of our second student, and you'll see that it prints out Parker, which is the last name of our second student in the console. But we're going to be interested in the email addresses. So let me go ahead and print out both the email addresses of our first and second student. There we go, student1.email, student2.email. If I go ahead and run this, you'll see that we have now, got both of the email addresses of our two students in the console. Hold on, I made a small typo. I of course need to add @mail.com to Sarah Parker's email. So let me just rerun that. Yeah, you see that this process which I just went through is quite cumbersome, and I even made a mistake with Sarah Parker's email address. And there must be a smarter way to do this. So this is exactly where classes in Python come in. So let us now go back to our class and delete the keyword pass. And I am going to paste in a small code block with our first class method, just to spend more time on the explaining and less time typing. So I've just pasted in this code block, and let us go through it to see what it does. So we've defined our class method, which is called init. You can think of this as initialize, and it takes 3 arguments. The first argument itself, which many people get confused with, is an object of the class student. For example, that could be our very first student, Bob, or our second student, Sarah. And the first and last are the first and last name of the corresponding student. So now I can go down here and type in the first and last name into the parentheses of our first student. So I can say Bob Griffin, and then our second student, Sarah Parker. And I'll have the two students created as objects of the class student, and I can now go ahead and print their email addresses. So print student1.email and print student2.email. Now the email over here in our class method is given in the line that I've just highlighted. You'll see that the way that we create the email address in our class method is by simply putting in the first and the last name into the corresponding places in the standardized email format. So remember before when we manually wrote the email address for every single student that we had? This was a very error-prone and tedious process. Now we have a class method which does this by default every time a student is created. Now, one thing to mention about the init method is that it is special in the way that it is executed every single time a new object of the class student is created. So you can see that when I go ahead and run this code now, we get the the email addresses of Bob Griffin and Sarah Parker with the method that I just introduced. And we get the email addresses of Bob Griffin and Sarah Parker with the method that we used beforehand. And if you compare the length of code, you can imagine that the first method is of course much more prone to errors and much longer. So let's go and delete that out for now and run it again, and you'll see that we still have the same result, but now have used a lot less lines of code. And that is sort of the idea behind classes. We've managed to create a blueprint for the students, and using this blueprint we have automatically created the email address of our students without having to manually assign it every time we add a new student. So when Python goes through this code line by line now, what happens is that it comes to the first student. It then creates the first object of the class student, which is Bob Griffin. And Bob Griffin gets passed into the init method as self. And then his first and last name, which is Bob and Griffin, are passed in over here as self first, self last. And a new attribute is created, self.email, which we go ahead and print out down here. Now, the same thing happens with Sarah Parker. Her data is passed in, her entry, is passed into the init method as self. So that is our second student. And then her first and last name get put into the placeholders for the email address, which we go ahead and print out down below. So to this point, we have added a new attribute to our students by giving them a standardized email address. Now I want to add another method into our class that allows us to perform an additional action. So let's create a method that allows us to generate the initials of a student. So let's just make another method over down here, and it is going to create the initials of the students. Remember that the first argument of every single class method needs to be an instance of the class. So let's write def for define, and then we're going to call the method which generates the initials initials. And the argument is going to be self. Then we are going to write that the first initial, first underscore initial, is going to be the first letter of the first name, is going to be self dot first, and then to access the first letter of the name, we need to access it using the square brackets and the index 0. The same thing we are going to do with the last name. So we're going to write last dot initial equals self dot last, and it is also going to be the first letter of the last name which we want, so we need to write 0 in the square brackets. And finally, we want the class method to return the first initial plus a space between the first and last initial plus the last initial. There. So now we have created our second class method. Let's see how we can now go on to print the initials of our students. So you can do that by now printing the student1 dot initials, and don't forget it's a method, that's why we still need the parentheses. And now I'll go ahead and run it, and you'll see that using our new class method initials, we've managed to create the initials of our first student, Bob Griffin, which is BG down here. And you need to remember that the initials is in fact a method. So as I mentioned before, you need to have these parentheses inside. Otherwise, if I take the parentheses out and now go ahead and print it, it will now not give you it will print the class method, but it will not print the return of the class method. So make sure to add the parentheses so that you indeed print out the return value. And of course, you can also go ahead and do the same thing for the initials of Sarah Parker. So if I duplicate the statement and adjust it to Sarah Parker, you'll see that it will now in the console output the initials of our first student, the initial of our second student, and the two email addresses that we have created using our init class method. Alright, so I'm going to leave it at that for this tutorial, but to summarize, what did we learn in this tutorial? We learned that everything in Python is, in fact, an object of a corresponding class. And classes can help us create blueprints for our objects. In the example that we studied during this video, we looked at students as being our objects. And we managed to create a class method which generates a standardized email address for all our students right off the get-go. So without having to manually input the standardized email address for every student, we managed to create a method which does this for us, which makes this process a lot simpler and less prone to errors. We also saw that we can create multiple methods within our classes by creating another method called initials, which gave us the initials of the students that we created. So overall, it's quite difficult to get your head around what classes are and how they work. And if this video helped you out, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and we'll see each other in the next video.